This isn't my 25th straight conference I worked out because we didn't have one during COVID, did we? But my first one was in 1999, which was not a dissimilar feeling and not a dissimilar situation to where the party finds itself now, strangely. But crucial to the discussion about the future of the Conservative Party will of course be a discussion about the future of the countryside and the Conservatives' relationship with the countryside. We have a wonderful panel today. Steve Barclay, you'll know, the Shadow Secretary of State, previously the Secretary of State. Greg Smith on the end, fine and upstanding MP for one of the most rural constituencies in the south of England. And Harriet Cross, a new MP, with a background in rural issues and a rural constituency as well. So it's great to invite you along, and especially our colleagues in Scotland, Scottish Countryside Alliance, are endlessly busy with issues affecting them in the countryside, both from Westminster and from Holyrood. So it'll be a very interesting British perspective from you as well. If it's all right, Harriet, I was going to ask you to start, say a few words, 2 or 3 minutes, then Greg, and then Steve, and then of course there'll be lots of opportunity for discussion and debate. Those who've been to Countryside Alliance Fringes before know that while I chair the meeting, I also use that position to ask questions and move discussion onwards. But I'm sure we'll have a very interesting discussion. Thank you all for coming. Harriet, would you like to take us away?
No, thank you, Tim, very much. And no, I'm delighted to be here and to see you all. And I think the reason that we're all in this room is that we all appreciate and understand just how important rural Britain and rural countryside and rural communities are to the fabric of the United Kingdom, and it's something that we really need to preserve and make sure are flourishing going forward. So in my patch up in Aberdeenshire, we are a huge number of farmers, a lot of rural estate owners as well. So it's really making sure that we are talking to them and talking to sort of the policies and procedures that are really important to them. Because farmers and local landowners, they aren't just in silos, they are the reason why we've got local shops, local communities. We need to retain our local bus links. Just because we're fewer in number in rural areas doesn't mean that we don't have sort of the needs and requirements for all the services that are also as important in cities. And what we really need to make sure is that now in opposition, but we're still speaking up for these rural areas, because it's very easy to sort of look at a rural area and just look at it in terms of numbers, especially from a policy and political perspective. There are less people there, so we can effectively impose on them, but that is not what we need. Our rural landscapes are vital that we protect them. Our rural farmers are vital for food security, for innovation. They are business owners, as anyone else who runs a business are, and it's very easy to look at a farmer differently than you'd look at another business owner trying to make ends meet in a really difficult, challenging trading environment. And we need to make sure, if we're claiming to be the party of business, which we always have been, we need to also be the party standing up for our farmers, because the two of them are indivisible. And then what I would like to see sort of going forward for how we can help protect rural areas against sort of what Labour are bringing in, is looking at things like how the countryside is going to change with infrastructure schemes. So where I am, obviously up in the north east Scotland, huge amount of offshore wind is going to be coming onshore into our areas. A load of new substations, batteries, pylons, and the impact that this will have, one on rural communities and then feeling of this being completely imposed on them, but then obviously as well taking agricultural land out of production. And it's not even just the quantum of land that's being taken, it's where farms are being left unviable because they're being split up, or sort of you're taking out sort of the important assets to them. So it's making sure we have an approach that's going to help stimulate our rural economies, that's not going to stymie them or help them stagnate because of policies that are being imposed on them. And I think together we've got strong rural voices in the Conservative Party, and that's what we should be doing and can do for the next few years.
Thank you, Harry. Very interesting. I'm sure will stimulate some questions in a moment. Greg.
Thanks, Tim. Afternoon, everyone. I've got to say that the last Fringe meeting I went to, they served me a steak, so I'm not sure what's going on at the Countryside Alliance. You've changed. But it really is great to be on this panel, because this, I would say this, wouldn't I, representing 336 square miles of entire rural Buckinghamshire, where my largest town is an 8,000 population town in Princes Risborough. Rural issues matter hugely to my constituents, but they matter, as Harriet has just said, to the whole country. And we have a problem in that the new government basically doesn't understand rural. They don't understand farming, they don't understand the countryside. We saw that in the derisory 87 words they put in their manifesto on the countryside going into this election. But actually it's slightly worse than not understanding the countryside. They are downright prejudiced when it comes to a number of key issues to the rural way of life. They are still obsessed with hunting. They still have made a big issue about trying to ban the perfectly legitimate activity of trail hunting. They are absolutely obsessed with that, and don't let anyone think that they're not going to then try and come after shooting and angling as well afterwards. And of course we have equally seen something that I'm sorry to say is now affecting my farmers in Buckinghamshire. I had a farmer in my surgery that's just basically had to have an entire herd put down because of bovine tuberculosis. They are still entirely nuts on the issue of bovine tuberculosis and want to end what we know works and what we in government enabled to save many herds and to stem the flow of bovine tuberculosis around the badger cull. We have got a problem in a Labour government that don't just not understand the countryside, but have these active prejudices against it. And we're going to have to stand up and fight and take those battles all over again that we have fought before if we are to maintain a rural way of life, as well as all the important things Harriet just said about rural services, about rural GP access, about rural broadband, about, heaven help me, in my constituency, mobile phone signal, which whilst the last government made huge strides to improve, and we should be rightly proud of the increase in access to fibre broadband in rural communities that we did deliver in government, there are still many communities that are without that, and we need to absolutely fight to ensure that this new Labour government doesn't forget rural communities as they continue the rollout of the shared rural network and fibre optic broadband. We've also got a job of education to do, and that, I'm afraid, Tim, is going to fall on the Alliance, on the NFU, on the CLA, on so many other organisations, because for the first time in a long time, there are actually a significant number of rural Labour members of Parliament. And speaking to some of them that actually won in Buckinghamshire, I'm sorry to say, I'm afraid there are only 2 of us left in Buckinghamshire. Actually, it's even worse than that. There are only 3 Conservative MPs left across the whole of the Thames Valley. That, you're having to get the picture cards out for some of them. Cow, sheep, pig, combine. And if we don't get them up to speed very, very quickly, then I think they're going to be letting down their constituents, but worse than that, rural communities across the whole country. So, Tim, this is where the Alliance always needs to stand up, along with your fellow organisations that represent the rural way of life, to do that job of education. When it's Conservatives in government, I'd like to think for the most part you are preaching to the choir. You are now having to preach and educate a team of politicians, particularly from the Labour Party, but the Lib Dems have those same wrong prejudices as well. They might like to pretend they're the friends of the countryside, but when they go around trying to enforce veganism in the town halls that they run, actually it's very transparent that they're not on farmers' side whatsoever. We really need all the organisations, and you've even put it in my bio, I'm a proud member of the Countryside Alliance as well as others. We really need those organisations to be pushing at the left of politics, who now find themselves in charge, to properly understand what the rural way of life needs, what rural communities need, what farmers need to maintain the British countryside for what we know it can and should be.
Thank you. Steve?
Great, thanks, Tim. Well, Harriet touched on the way things have been imposed on the countryside, and we've seen that very early on, the way Miliband's been riding roughshod over death row and the rural interests with the decisions on solar farms, the decisions that Keir Starmer said they're going to take on pylons without listening to local communities. And Greg touched on it in terms of the ignorance and the prejudice in the approach to some of the comments that have been made, and some of the uncertainty and worry that's been caused. I mean, TB, Greg mentioned, it's very vague. We know it will take some time before vaccines are ready for widespread deployment, and they've left a lot of uncertainty as to what that will mean then in terms of their approach. And you can see that there, in Donors, for example, the Extinction Rebellion, Donor is a key figure within the Labour movement. They're going to be making demands that I think are very much unsympathetic to the interests, certainly of the rural community that I represent. And that's why, Tim, I think the voice that the Countryside Alliance represents is so important. And I'd really break that down into 4 areas. I think firstly, I think we need to have a relentless focus on food production. Now, I don't subscribe to the view that it is either food or flowers, as sometimes some people say. Minette Batters use the phrase the 2 sides of the same coin, the environment and food production. But I certainly, as Secretary of State, recognise that there was a concern that we had not sufficiently focused on the food production side. And as someone who was in the Treasury at the time of the national crisis, I know just how important our resilience is, our national security is, how costs escalate. At that time, we see the news today just in terms of the wider insecurity in the world. And I think one of the things moving forward is to make sure that in the next round schemes, we are relentlessly focusing on the importance of food production and doing that in a way that is sympathetic to the environment, but really recognising that is central to the approach. And that was absolutely central to my approach when I was Secretary of State. The second, and Harriet touched on this, really is understanding the rural complexity. So farming, fishing are very important, but it is also about the housing, the schools, the skills, the transport. And quite often funding formulas are weighted towards city-urban regions at the expense of rural areas. Just look at the way bus funding, for example, works. You can see that as an example. So, as a responsible opposition, we want to be working with the Lords, tabling amendments, working with you in terms of how we make the case. So, for example, where there's no aspiration in rural communities or where there's rural deprivation, that we're ensuring that those are given visibility rather than sometimes the prejudice we see in terms of a view that the rural areas are all affluent, which is not the case. I think the third thing is around the rural voice, and I'm concerned again there's been an over-emphasis towards the arm's length bodies and the NGOs. And again, it's not about setting one group against another at all. Often there's links. I was chatting with the National Trust, who themselves have many tenant farmers. But I do think, one of the specific changes I made as Secretary of State was on the Habitat Restoration Fund, because most of that money was going to NGOs. And I changed it so only farmers could apply, because 73% of the land is actually managed by farmers. And in my experience, representing many farmers, there's no one I've met that cares as much about the environment as the farmers who actually live and work on the land, and therefore actually empowering them and making that central to the funding routes, I thought was very important. And that also goes, for example, to Labour's decision to get rid of Kate Rock, for example, as a non-exec. I brought Kate in. I actually commissioned Kate's review, the tenant review, when I was in number 10. And then when I went to DEFRA, I appointed Kate as a non-exec because she really spoke up for tenant farmers. And I'm very surprised and disappointed that the current Secretary of State has decided to get rid of her from the DEFRA board. And I think having the voice of tenants, again, is a key audience and the sort of thing we should be championing. And then the final point I'd make is around rural identity. And it's interesting, Labour's very quick to defend identity in many other areas. But then when it comes to the countryside and things like country sports, they seem to be quite disdainful of things. And there's a rich tapestry. It's not just the shooting, it's the small businesses that link to that. It's the mental health, the loneliness, it's the way communities come together. It's the traditions, it's the things people value. And I think there's a rural identity that we need to respect and champion. And I think an urban government where the Secretary of State gets his designer well as one more dollar from his Croydon base is just not sympathetic to that sort of rural identity. And it's important that we come together and make sure that we're safeguarding that moving forward. In fact, I'm sure, Tim, no one is in any doubt that you are a man who buys his own wares.
Thank you, Steve. I do that. There's some really interesting stuff there. Interesting how much renewables come up, and that's something we're picking up a lot from our constituency as well. I did warn everyone that I do like to abuse my position. I am just going to pick up a point of Greg, and as Greg made and Steve followed up. The Alliance is before opening up to the rest of the floor. The Alliance is an apolitical organisation, which means we're equally critical of everyone. And we have been very critical of the Labour Party in the past. We produced a report with the Fabians back in 2018, which absolutely slated their rural priorities. In fairness, there have been omissions by the current leadership, however much we might in this room take the view that it's real, that they were wrong, and that they have tried at least to align their priorities more with those of rural people. I do have a massive challenge. We've identified 143 new Labour MPs with a rural element in their constituency. That's just new ones. I mean, it's a huge job getting around those people, and we've started that process. We were at the Labour conference obviously last week, so a huge job of work to be done there. But, and there's many who know my past in this party, in this room, but I have to say that within that, I think we have to be honest with ourselves and have self-awareness about what has happened over the last decade in rural constituencies, as well as in the rest of the country. And there was an extraordinary period, frankly, after the 2019 election, until we got some more sensible people in the Secretary of State's job in DEFRA, where the agenda of the last Conservative government was a million miles from the priorities of rural people. You know, when we had this absolutely cataclysmic change to agricultural support and all the things we were talking about, and we were fighting battles over an animal sentience bill, which is possibly one of the most appalling pieces of legislation I've ever seen in my life. And we were having to sit on an animal sentience bill, which could have caused, with the kept animals bill, which could have caused all sorts of chaos for activities from shooting to hunting to everything else. And how is it? You know, I think we do have to answer this question. Well, you have to answer it as a party. You know, how is it we got into that state, and how do we rebuild the trust of the rural community more widely, and ensure that they understand that your priorities are aligned with theirs, with our members, and make damn sure it doesn't happen again, because it was an extraordinary period, frankly, and where the interests of rural people were taken for granted, 100%. And even going back to your point, Greg, about preaching to the choir, that's what David Cameron thought in 2010 to 2015. There was a thing called the Commission for Rural Communities, which was supposed to essentially to look after rural communities, which was the only quango which was burnt in the bonfire of the quangos, as I remember, because it was said it wasn't needed. Well, I can promise you that from our position in 2019, 2020, 2021, it was desperately needed. So sorry to start with that, but I do think we need to address these issues. I don't know who wants to go first. Greg, I picked on you first.
That's fine, Tim. Look, first of all, I'm going to be very clear, we do have a lot to be proud of from our 14 years ago. Of course we do. However, the proof of the pudding was we watched the results come in after the 4th of July general election. There is a reason there are only 121 of us. You know, 3 out of 121 MPs are sat in front of you right now, and so we do have to put our hands up of where we went awry, where in those few areas we did let people down, and we got bitten very badly at the ballot box for it. That is part of the process of the reflection and of the rebuilding that we now have to do to ensure that we do have a platform at the next general election to ensure this is only a one-term Labour government and that we can return to power. Rural communities were hurting in some elements, and we need to have those honest, open discussions, not just with the communities themselves, but with the organisations like the Alliance that represent them, to ensure that our platform going into the way it's going to be a 5-year parliament, right? They're not going to run after 4 years at this rate. At the 2029 general election is a solid and robust one. I take your point about preaching to the choir. There are lessons to be learned, and let's get on and do it.
Well, likewise, I think legislation sits first with ministers. Now, the environment matters to many voters. Animal welfare matters to many voters. But what I signalled and what the emphasis I tried to bring when I was at Wellington Secondary State was also food security also matters.
Yeah.
And these things are about balance, and I think one of the great things, one of the greatest benefits we have is we have control, so we can now shape this policy. And we shouldn't look back on the past as if the previous system was perfect. 50% of the money under the EU went to 10% of landowners. Now, I don't think a system where 50% of the money goes to 10% of landowners, and it's irrespective of what they do, what the outcomes are, is as good a system as one where we have control, we can design that. And I don't think it's an either or. I think if we have new plant and equipment that, for example, reduces pesticide use by 70%, that reduces the cost of the food production to the farmer, but also it's very good for the environment. If you have, as I did in the River Wye, where we asked 35 million to deal with the chicken litter, you're not constraining chicken production, but you're doing so in a way that is good for our waterways, and is good actually for salmon and our fishing and our anglers. So there's ways of getting that balance, but there's also lessons that we need to take on board with these new schemes that we're getting up and running in terms of where that balance was. I think also that there's a wider lesson, and that's really around the balance between government and arm's length bodies. And certainly one of the frustrations I often heard, because I, as a minister, wanted to sort of very much sort of get out and about to meet people, but I think that's, you find out most not behind the desk, but actually out speaking to people. And quite often there would be frustrations with Natural England or frustrations with the Environment Agency. And then when you would challenge that as a minister, they would often say, well, there's not much you can do, Minister, there's primary legislation, we're going to enforce that, we're going to take a risk-averse view, because if we don't, there may be a judicial review, and if you're not happy, change the legislation, that takes 18 months, but otherwise, and I think in terms of using this time that Greg says as to how we reflect on our time in office, thinking about that balance between what is right for arm's length, but also the ability of ministers to respond to the needs of rural areas as rural MPs as we are. And I think that balance wasn't where it needed to be. And I think part of the discussion we'll have over the coming months and years is how we get a better balance between the role of ministers and those of arm's length bodies.
If I'm being really naughty, I would point out one of your predecessors who appointed the ex-chief executive of Friends of the Earth and leader of the Green Party as chief executive of Natural England. Probably didn't help with that. Harry, you're absolved from all responsibility for it.
I will take that absorption out.
But from standing back and asking you, how do you think the party should be tackling this whole connecting with the rural community after that? Potentially that difficult period after 2019.
I think what's important is realising that rural communities, while unique, we have the same aspirations as anyone else in the country. We still want really good schools for people to go to. We still want access to healthcare. We still want connections to services. We still want our businesses, whatever form they are, to be able to succeed with as little intervention as possible. So those sort of things aren't unique depending on if you're in a city, if you're in a town, if you're in the countryside. It's how they're implemented and how they're imposed. And what we often forget, and I think across the board is often forgotten, is that take farms. Farms have passed down through so many generations. There is so much knowledge on an individual farm of what works in this specific area, which fields are best for this crop or that crop, which inputs are the ones that actually make the difference, which ones don't. And the more you impose on a farmer, the more difficult it becomes for them to farm as efficiently as possible. And efficient farming is good farming as far as returns that they get in regards to food security, in regards to preserving the environment as well, because a healthy farm is a productive farm, and a productive farm is a more profitable farm. So it's very easy to get from A to B to see that actually if you take a step back and delegate out to the farmer or the landowner or the rural business owner who actually have to manage in the environment, their unique environment, because more so than in cities, rural areas are very unique. And the more that you actually give back and give liberty to them to actually take forward the decisions that they need to make, the more efficient and more effective and more valuable your rural areas will become. And I think governments across the board can see that. And I'll use the example of Scotland. Scotland is quite extraordinary what the SNP government are doing up there in terms of land reform and rural communities. So there's a bill going through at the moment called the Land Reform Scotland Act. And this effectively gives the government a huge amount of say over how any bit of scale of land. So, I mean, this sounds huge, but like anything over 1,000 hectares, which in Scotland is not unusual. That's unimaginable, how they can be run. So if you want to sell your land over 1,000 hectares, you have to apply to the government. They will review if you can sell it, who you can sell it to, how it can be lotted. You then can't sell an individual lot to more than one connected party. You also have to offer things to communities first, and that's just the start, that's just part one of the act, there's a second part too. So, and I think everyone sitting in this room can actually appreciate how much impact that will have on a rural community, because scale is so important in rural areas. There is so much land which is unproductive, and the best farmer, best landowner will not be able to make that land productive. But the reason it can actually subsist is because it's in with other areas which can. And breaking up land, breaking up estates, breaking up generations of knowledge from a bit of an area of land really, really does impact what we can do going forward. And that generally has come from the SNP government liking intervention. They like to be involved, they like control. The Labour Party in Scotland, and this is again reverts back to where we are now, has backed them the whole way. They always come down on the side of the SNP government, especially when they were down in line with the Greens as well, when they were in coalition, supporting the SNP mandate to impose as much regulation as possible on our rural communities. So we need to stand really, really strong and be really, really clear that any sort of intervention, unless it's really, really minimal and actually focused, will impact a rural community more than we can ever imagine, and you can't track it, because how it affects one will affect another, and it's something that all governments need to be aware of. And I mean, as I say, rural communities know best how to manage their area. I mean, I've got, my patch is about 800, 900 square miles, and sort of like my biggest town's about 8,000. And if I travel from one to the other, they have such different needs in different places. They look very different, feel very different, have very different people in them. And there's no way that a government in Westminster or a government in Holyrood can say what's best for each of them. Only the people who are living there and actually understand and experience that community knows what's best for what's happening there.
Thank you. I promised to stop being provocative and chairman from now on. We'll take questions. We'll probably take, there's got a lot of hands up, so we'll probably take 2 or 3 depending on, and then ask the panel to address it.
Thank you. So we're councillors in South Cambridgeshire where we have next to no Conservative elected representatives now, or in control of any of the councils. And what you've spoken about is a lot about national government, and that is really important. But it doesn't feel like enough is given on local government. Because at the end of the day, where we are, it's Liberal Democrat controlled. They are deciding the planning. They are deciding education. They are deciding roads. The fact in my ward, I had to fight to have a road open because they tried to close a road in Harvest where the farm was. These are things that they just won't think about. In education, when my daughter was 4 and she's grown up in farming and shoots and everything, so she's very familiar with the process of food production, when she said to another child at school that what they were eating was cow because it was spaghetti bolognese, I got a call to say that she'd upset a child by saying where the food can come from. I'm actually very proud that my daughter knows the cycle of life and where food comes from. And these are things that actually, farmers that I represent, a lot of the problems and blockers they face are from local government decisions. And it just feels like that's not necessarily given enough credence. And how would you fix that? Because actually we're on the ground and we're speaking, I have 60 farms in my ward.
So how do we fix local government? So the gentleman there.
Just a really brief one. So just about home truths. Basically, I think the perception among the electorate is that Conservative ministers were allowing DEFRA and also DESNES on the energy front, which impacts farming, to do their own thing. And despite being in office, we weren't sort of controlling these people that were coming up with crazy ideas. And you will have spoken to loads of stakeholders, all of you, who, when you mentioned DEFRA to them, they just burst out laughing. So how do we control those civil servants from taking the crazy decisions?
We might take those 2 and Steve, sorry.
Yeah, that's probably for me, not least as a Cambridgeshire MP. So I think, well, first we've got County Council election coming up in Cambridgeshire. We also have the Metro Mayor election coming up next May. And I think, so the Lib Dem policy of making as many people as possible driving 20 miles an hour, I don't think it's popular in the fence in my part of the world, so we should make that very, Debbie, I'm sure will concur. I think one of the things I did as Secretary was get Will Quince to do the Quince review, how we better use as part of our Brexit freedoms public sector procurement in county councils, a great opportunity to do that. There's ways of doing that again in ways that are good for the environment, lower food miles, but where we actually incentivise our local producers around Cambridge is to supply the local schools and make sure that our public sector procurement, and outside the EU, we actually can do that in a much freer way, and that's all there. I think part of it is transparency and accountability, so the potholes which the Liberal County Council in Cambridge are responsible for are shocking in Fenland, and one of the things I was always, as a former Chief Secretary, interested is following the money, how much has been allocated and where does it go. I mentioned buses where there's a bias towards Cambridge. You see that in other grants, so cycling grants almost always used to go to Cambridge and so forth. But in terms of what we can do about it, not least, as I say, we've got elections coming up, is to work together around the transparency in the case studies and holding them to account. Because what we know, particularly with Lib Dems, is they like to say one thing in one place and a totally different thing in another. And so whether in a farming constituency, they're talking about how pro-farming they are, and then elsewhere, the Lib Dem Council will be banning meat and sort of having a load of sort of environment measures that are counter often to some of these interests. So I think it's working together with May in mind, having greater transparency, and the Lib Dems in Cambridge are the incumbents, and we should absolutely be holding them much more to account. On the death threat officials, and obviously as a minister, one has challenges around this. I think that again, there's several things. So firstly, often when people talk about its death threat, the decisions are actually being taken by on-site bodies like Natural England, by the Environment Agency, and I touched on that earlier around the accountability of that. And as a minister that did question those things, as I say, quite often I was told, very interesting minister, but if the primary legislation says X, that is what we're going to do. Now, in my case, I issued 2 ministerial directions, even though I was only in death for 6-7 months. I think they're the only 2 ministerial directions issued, as well as aware. So one was to better compensate the fishing fleet in Cornwall, and the second was to insist on the clean-up of Horswood in Kent. So to say no ministers are willing to challenge, I can give you examples where, as a minister, I was willing to challenge, but we need to understand the legislative framework. And ultimately, ministers can't have or fire civil servants either, so that's all part of sort of the wider issue. But I think the other point about it actually is, the other thing I try to do as a minister is just bring more transparency. So if I go to a previous role in health, one of the issues there is, again, if anything goes wrong in the health system, it's always Secretary of State for Health's fault, even though the health secretary is usually just finding out when it's on Twitter, and not before. And so one of the things there was to look at how we had much more transparency on the data. Where is there similar imports, similar demographics, but very different outcomes? So why is it that one operating theatre is running many more procedures than another? And is there a good reason for that? And making those that data much more transparent. What you tend to find in health, that it's awash with information in the system, but it's not very usable data and it's not very clear to the public. And there's a lot more, particularly the AI coming through, that can do to make that more transparent, which I think plays to Harriet's point that actually different towns have different needs, and the more transparent we can make that, the better the debate is then targeted around those towns.
Harriet, how do we make local government work for us?
It is a real issue, and I mean, I'm up in Scotland and we have exactly the same issue about local government. I think a lot of it, again, is finite budgets, and budgets are tight, and again, it comes back to where the mass of people are, and they'll put more money into places where they're going to get their votes. I mean, that's basic. But that doesn't mean it's right, and that doesn't mean how it should be. One thing we're really trying to look at in our local government is things like procurement. Where are things out, like, for example, take food in schools, where is this being sourced from? And we're really keen to get it sort of, I can't remember exactly what the figures were, but it was like 60% within 60 miles of the local authority, actually bring production closer to home, have more of an actually responsibility of knowing where things are coming from. as same as kids' point of view. I mean, every backstory you told, it is unbelievable, completely unbelievable. But it will be repeated across the country because there is such a lack of understanding now of the cycle of food production. And I think a lot of that comes down to because we've lost seasonality. So much food now we can get all year round, it doesn't matter what it is. And therefore, the actual link between food and the environment and farming is lost. It's food as a shop as opposed to food as a process to get to the shop. And things like that, I mean, that's not going to solve the issue that we're talking about, but I think it's something to sort of reflect on. In terms of sort of roads, education, planning in local areas, planning is huge, and obviously that's the big one for what actually impacts local and rural areas in particular. Neighbourhood plans, local development plans, again, they're great, but they have to actually work for the area that they're being imposed on. And we'll know certainly in sort of the more sort of isolated areas, infrastructure is not there to support housing, and infrastructure is not there to necessarily support the services which you need to sort of link these things together. And it's all well and great sort of having a hub somewhere in the ward or somewhere in the council, but you can't get there, and it doesn't benefit the actual communities, which are probably more reliant on it, because a lot of the time as well, older populations live in more rural populations, and therefore they're the ones actually more in need of these services which councils should offer. And actually, how do we link it up? How do we make sure that councils are working for everyone? And that includes rural communities, that includes the elderly, and that includes the businesses, the farmers and the children, who all rely on the same, effectively all pay the same council tax. So like, we better all be serving them efficiently. But planning is a big one, and planning is where a lot of people sort of have the most connection in terms of visually with what their council are offering. And it's not an easy thing to fix. It's really not, because as well, if we're looking at energy infrastructure, it is a national endeavour to sort of upgrade the grid, to bring in new energy technologies. But the infrastructure has to go somewhere. It has to go somewhere. But it's actually who's going to stand up for the rural communities and the local authorities to make sure that they're the ones actually getting the say. And again, with some planning for infrastructure, some of it goes to your local authority, but then some of it actually goes to central government as well. So it's understanding where the balance is, who's actually accountable. Is it the councillors who are accountable? Is it the officers in the council who are responsible? Or is it being deferred down to sort of people making decisions a long way away who don't know the area, who don't feel the area, and effectively aren't accountable to the area? So that sort of disparity in what goes to where in planning is something that does need to be reflected on, or at least give, where it does get sent down to sort of Westminster or Holyrood for the decision, there must be some sort of statutory say for the local authority to have an input in that, because otherwise it's just so distracted and so far from when the decision is being made.
Greg, the local council, I'm sure you can help us on that, and also perhaps the question of in government but not in power.
Sure. Let's say the local government point first. I did spend a long time in local government much earlier in my career, but I literally represented a ward called Town in Fulham, in the noughties. But I'm actually very lucky that I still have a Conservative council. And you know that's not something many of us in fact 2 councillors in my constituency are in the audience. I can see, but just because you've got a Conservative council still means you've got these incredible challenges that come down, particularly on the planning point through the NPPF and national planning policy and so on. And of course, you know, I mean, to your point about the Liberal Democrats, well, you know, no party has ever been more capable of simultaneously campaigning for one thing in their local patch while calling for the precise opposite on the national stage. Everyone remembers the Chesham and Amersham by-election where they simultaneously managed to say they were going to scrap HS2 on the ground while their transport spokesman was on her feet in the chamber of the House of Commons wanting HS2 to be built bigger and faster and with more money. They are entirely capable of saying 2 different things at the same time. And it's Liberal Democrat councils up and down the land that actually, whilst they're trying to pretend they're the friends of rural communities, are passing some of the most hideous planning applications on prime agricultural land and taking away from food production. I think the biggest challenge that we've got that will face councils of all colours coming up in the recent years is the consultation that's just closed on the new NPPF. As a humble backbencher in the last Parliament, I spent 2 years negotiating with Michael Gove to get an explicit, which I won, it's rare that you win with Michael, but I won, to get an explicit recognition of land use in food production put in the NPPF. Sadly, it was a footnote, but it still had legal clout, because this old best and most versatile test is a lawyer's paradise. You can put any bunch of lawyers in a room and they can come up with 25 different answers as to whether it is best or indeed most versatile. Whereas the line I got put in there was protections for land used in food production. That is a binary test. It either it is or it is not. And what's the first thing Angela Rayner is consulting on taking out of the NPPF? That footnote. Gone. Hopefully everybody in this room replied to the consultation saying she should keep it. I'm sure you all did. But we've got to, as we reflect on what our offer is at the next general election, have a proper debate about land use in this country. I know there was a land use framework planned, but again, a new Labour government's come in. Ed Miliband, without reading anything, has signed off 6,000 acres of agricultural land to solar. I've got a 2,100 acre proposal in my own constituency that will end up, I'm sorry to say, on Ed Miliband's desk through the NSIP process. I'm fighting it very vigorously because this is on land that produces 10 tonne a hectare wheat harvests. That is not land that should be taken over for ground-mounted solar. So we do actually need to give local government power to determine, as Harriet says, what is right for those communities, and particularly when that comes to the cumulative impact of big infrastructure, because the system we've got at the moment stops all our councils considering things outside the merits of that one particular case. So it is no surprise that you have loads of, my hobby horse at the moment, ground-mounted solar applications coming in just under the NSIP limit, coming in at 49.9 megawatts, funnily enough. It's strange, that number, isn't it? But 3 or 4 different separate applications with slightly different company names, because they're actually all the same company, that end up creating, turning villages into islands completely surrounded by ground-mounted solar. So we've got to empower our councils much more to actually be able to bite back on cumulative impact grounds, which, to be fair, Claire Coutinho did bring in a cumulative impact test just before we left office. We need that back, and not the attitude that Labour have got. The in office but not in power. I've had my fights with Natural England as a backbender, as I'm sure Steve had as Secretary of State. I think we do have to have a think about what we, and this is an uninstinctive position for a Conservative to take, have a think about what we do want to bring back in-house so that ministers can actually be in control of it, rather than putting things out to third parties, let alone the civil service. I think that is something we need to have a long, careful look at as we produce our plan for government in the future.
Thank you. We've got the lady here.
I'd be very interested in your view on what we can do to make small farms more economically viable. I'm conscious, I grew up in Cheshire, I've also got family in the Thames Valley, and I've spent 16 years living in North East Fife. All of those areas, I've seen small farms go out of business on land which actually was quite good farmland.
Thank you for that. The gentleman right at the back, Mr. Wall.
Yeah, it's a question for Steve really. Obviously you were there when the basic payment scheme was getting phased out, but obviously everyone else can chime in. In the US, they do really have a big focus on particular food products subsidisation, so particularly corn. So given that leaving the European Union, you've got some more options in subsidies, do you think that direct food subsidies would have a future, particularly given that you stress the importance of focusing on food security and food production?
Have we got another farming question, since we've had 2 there? Is there anything on farming? Joe?
Thanks, Tim. I've spent, as you know, a very considerable amount of my time at the bar defending farmers against insane laws and the insane way in which they're interpreted by officials, both at local and national level. I just want to pick up on what Greg and Steve and indeed you have said about people being out of touch. Greg has talked about the picture cards, and Steve has talked about Lord Alley and his custom-made £420 wellies that people can sort of muck around on farms and pretend they know about the agricultural industry in respect of. I would cite this new law about the registration of chickens, which is rather grabbed everyone's attention. The idea of an individual chicken being registered by farmers is something which is causing a lot of my friends a lot of concern. We're out of power, and we need to understand that. And we're going to be out of power a long time. And there are people wandering around talking about what the Conservative Party is going to do. What we can actually do is exercise soft power. Common sense isn't that common. You know, the picture cards, cow, pig. The custom-made wellies for people who are out of touch and don't know how farmers dress on farms. Making legislation that is devoid of any common sense. We can be local voices. We can choose candidates and spokesmen. We can use councillors as voices of still small voices of calm crying out against the Miliband's and the other individuals who are shrill. But we are facing an existential crisis in farming in this country. The ability of the nation to feed itself is in issue. Sue Gray is sitting on the National Security Council. Nobody cares about farming. Actually, there are people who actually want to see Britain not in a position where it can feed itself, in my view. What can we do as Conservatives to exercise all the power we have, the soft power, that's all we have. What can we do to help the country save itself?
Thank you, Joe. So, Harriet, would you start us on that? How do we make small farms economical? Direct subsidy. We really are stepping back in time there, but those who are there, and an avoid common sense in the countryside.
Yeah, so I mean, small farms are generally the long-standing family farms which have come down through so many generations, and are so often cash poor, really cash poor, and that's why they struggle year to year. And one thing is actually, it's in my inbox at the moment, which is why it's the top of my mind, but a really important thing is actually making sure that when we are getting annual payments, or the they're called RPA payments in Scotland, but the equivalent in down here, basic payment scheme, that they're actually coming on time, because that allows you to plan into sort of the year to come. And I mean, you can't fall behind on when your deadlines are, but sort of it seems to be okay, but so your payments can come in late. But I'd like to see more actually on how to make small farms efficient and effective. So whether that's changing capital allowances for buildings, or sort of increasing investment into new kits to make you more efficient, or changing or making planning more sort of adaptable so you can diversify, bring in sort of, I don't know, short-term lets, or whatever you need, whatever works in your area, in order to just diversify that income stream. Because depending on what sort of farm you have, obviously you've got sort of peaks and troughs through the year. You get a big check at one point, and then you have to make it last. And then that doesn't help at all if and when there's sort of a shock comes halfway through. So we need to be protecting small farms in particular against that. Or, for example, as we saw, was it fertiliser a couple of years ago? I remember having a conversation with someone who had bought it a month ago for about £300, and then suddenly they were like, it's now 800, do I risk it, or is it going to go higher? And a big farm don't like to cope with it, but they can cope with it. Small farms really, really cannot. Another thing which I think is vital, and I think it's up to all of us up here, but also everyone in the room, is actually to really shout about the importance of things like inheritance tax to the next succession of small farms. Small farms cannot afford inheritance tax bills, especially if things like agricultural property relief or business property relief are removed. And a real fear of mine is that that is going to be a target for this Labour government, again, because they just do not understand farming. In one of the hustings I had before the election, this came up, and the Labour candidate said, yeah, but if someone has £1 million worth of property, they should be paying inheritance tax. It's like, you honestly do not understand how, that is barely a farm, that's a few fields. In some part of the country, it'll be a very few acres. So it's just a complete lack of understanding of actually what impact these policies can have. But yeah, but as I say, small farms, I think, for sort of making them more efficient, helping with sort of kit and infrastructure, however that can be done, and releasing planning to sort of allow you to sort of to diversify where needed. And common sense approach, you're completely right, and that's down to everyone. And I think it's not down to just sort of elected people at the front, or especially our councillors, but anyone who is related in the rural community knows a lot of people who aren't from rural communities, and it's actually getting that voice and getting it spread. I think one, not criticism, but a sort of thing that I've noticed with people from rural areas is we're quite proud of being rural, and like, but it almost feels like a bit of a closed club. Like, we need to invite people to understand rural issues, rural communities, because that's the only way that we're actually going to make sure that our needs and our requirements and actually our benefit can be felt and seen and understood across the whole country. Because as I come back to again, there's a far fewer of us than there are people living urbanly. So we need to make sure that actually our voices are heard and actually understood across the board.
Well, in terms of small farms, I think first help them reduce their costs. So energy costs obviously is a big one. So we have grants on solar and batteries, for example. It's reducing costs around or challenges around water, so making it easier to put an on-farm reservoir, for example, convincing the bureaucracy of that. It's on labour, so the grants we put into things like pack houses, so you can reduce your reliance on labour and drive up your automation. I touched on the new grants for machinery that are used for this pesticide, good for the environment, but also reduces your costs. Slurry grants in terms of your waste, if you can also with waste turn that into energy and also separate out the phosphates, obviously that again you actually build that circular farm. So I think the programme we were, which was to shift from it being about the environment into things that were supporting food production, but also good for the environment. But actually what that does is good because, and as Conservatives, take a step back, we should be driving productivity. We should be making our farms more competitive. That is good to bring the next generation through, because also that is important to the sector. And I think that links to the second question, because for me it's less about subsidy. As a Conservative, what it's about is how do we drive productivity on our farms, and what are the costs on labour, give confidence, which we did on the decision like push worker scheme, but link that to more automation so that we can actually bring those things down. Second, what can we do on the food security? A practical example. So those, we touched on a number of councillors in the room, so one of the things that delivers 250 times productivity is controlled environment growing. We have about 10% of the strawberries in winter this summer. Why? Because they grow to travel from long distances, therefore the less flavoursome. If you look at what Dyson's doing in Lincolnshire, start to see much more robotics, controlled environment, actually more attractive, so people that are not working, again as Conservatives want to get people back into the labour market, it's much more attractive if they're working in a controlled environment. Things are at waist height, you can have more automation, you actually have far less pesticide, better water use, but actually you reduce the food miles. So near Cambridge, you then have that controlled environment growing, your leafy greens, your soft fruits. You're not importing all those things, like your tomatoes from Spain, southern Spain. You're actually creating jobs near to the cities, low food miles, much more resilient for food security, much more automation. And you start to also maximise other bits of government. Our 400 million of R&D funding in there that starts to then have wider benefits. So building that sort of innovation, new skills in the countryside, new job opportunities, I think is important. And third, I touched earlier on arms and bodies, and there's someone who was attacked when I was health secretary for being challenging officials, and I was attacked as deputy secretary, not least actually on a NSIP where I was accused of being against, well, I was concerned about an incinerator, and I was attacked about that. So always slightly sort of critical of ministers are never questioning what officials say. But let me give you a more serious example. So one of the tragic cases I dealt with as Secretary of State was the suicide of Bond, where an inspection had gone and picked up an extremely minor, but it had been a tipping point for the individual concerned. And so one of the changes I made was to shift inspections from surprises towards where there was notice. Because my view is people are trying to do the right thing, they're often under huge stress. And actually what the inspection should be doing is advising and helping, not trying to catch people out. And I thought that was very important within that wider debate of mental health and support, but also because to me it comes back to this fundamental relationship which Harriet and Gregor talked about, which is I think people on farm want to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing for the environment because they care passionately about the environment. They often want to pass it on to their next generation. So they want to do the right thing for the environment. They want to do the right thing by animal welfare. They want to do the right thing in terms of their farm, but they're competing with lots of different challenges. And I think the role of the ombudsman bodies is to help and support, not to see it as some exercise to find a particular ear tag that's the wrong colour or something like that. And I think having that supportive environment, not catching people out, but advising and supporting, is an important part of the role of the bodies, which is public servants are to serve those, it's not to try and catch them out on the line of infringement.
Greg.
I'm going to violently agree with everything Harriet and Steve just said. I think the only thing that probably is a comms challenge for all of us that I would add to that is the number of people who love the idea of the countryside but don't really understand that it wouldn't look how it does if it wasn't for farmers. I'll never forget a particularly left-wing constituent that was having a go at me a few years ago when I was standing up for farmers and they didn't really like the idea of farming at all, really. It was a really bizarre conversation. And they seemed to think that it was the council that cut the hedges. And they seemed to think that the countryside just sort of looked like that because that was nature. They didn't understand that actually land is managed. And that if it wasn't for farmers, it wouldn't look like that. It would be a sprawling, overgrown mess. And it wouldn't be attractive to go walking in and all the things that they thought the countryside was for. So I think we've got a job to do to actually explain that if reliefs go from agricultural property and the 300, 400, 500 acre family farms have to sell a third of them in order to meet the inheritance tax bill, and therefore they do categorically cease to be viable businesses and won't be farms anymore, that rural Britain is not going to look like it does today. It is going to be materially different. And there's a lot of people out there, particularly in urban communities, that really won't get that. And we've got to win the hearts and minds to explain to them that the net result of some of these crazy ideas coming through that, could still happen in the budget or a future budget. They've been trailed a little bit, largely by the outliers rather than the centre. But if these happen, we're looking at a totally different landscape on top of the impact on food security and everything that Harriet and Steve quite rightly mentioned in their replies.
Thank you, Greg. I think, again, to abuse my position, but I think there is a challenge at which many in the farming sector accept that there has been abuse of agricultural inheritance, and in particular, the active farm, the status of the active farmer. And so in many parts of the country, especially arable parts of the country, there's undoubtedly people be buying land. And the 5-year farm business tenancy, as we know, Steve, is not the ideal solution to anything, frankly, because you have a very short-term view of management. So I think that from an alliance perspective, there has to be an ability to pass agricultural land from one generation to the other, and that's critical for the maintenance of the countryside with people in it, and crucially. But I don't, our view would be though that there's probably room for at least questioning how that happens, because in many ways actually it makes it very difficult for people to come into the sector because there's so much competition around the purchase of land. Because there's value for avoiding inheritance tax. It's a conundrum. The lady in the green.
Yes, hello, Shuna Mitchell. I'm in North Bedfordshire, so I'm between two areas. And I mentioned to you the other day that on the one hand I have water meadows that are completely flooded. I'm a medic's daughter, a clergyman, and a smallholder's granddaughter from Ireland. And my mother was brought up in Dunfermline in a council house. Now these people have been brought up with feet on the ground, practicalities, etc. So when you talk about scale in Scotland, and you're talking about Thames Valley, and here I am in Bedfordshire, which is Buckinghamshire on its north side and Cambridgeshire, what people don't seem to realise is how simple it is. There's outside, there's planet, and there's inside. And at the moment, I did fine art, so this is just an image, I'm not very good with words. Labour is the cuckoo in the nest. And they don't realise that this planet is fragile but robust. I was at a talk yesterday evening by the British berry growers, which was fascinating, including one gentleman who does the polytunnels, was talking about actually in China, grade A soil and grade B soil is protected for food production. It went on to say that all these wind turbines that are proposed, the concrete that goes into land, even if the turbine goes at some stage, the concrete remains, so you're losing land. Now we're a small British Isles with a huge population, and the role of something like, and this comes down to semantics and words, you know, countryside, rural, environment, regions. Nature is a green canvas, administration is regions. Really, there has to be a rethink of this idea of rural and countryside, and back to, I think so too the other day, planet, because that is going to get the imagination of younger people and urbanites and everybody else, and that actually people who live in the countryside are their custodians and guardians.
Okay.
I don't know if I articulated this particularly well.
So how do we?
Yes,
how
that
do
there
we
is a whole
illustrate that?
perception thing. Take the public with you, with new ways of expressing and explaining.
Okay, thank you for that. How do we illustrate that? George?
Thank you.
Yeah, we all know, and we can see the evidence, or rather lack of it, that we've lost the rural vote. But what will affect people in this room in particular is we've also got a crisis in rural membership. And you know, I know lots of farmers in their 60s and their 70s and their 80s who are members of the party. Their children aren't. And we have a problem in our party that we are not recruiting the rural members who, you know, in the urban areas, that's where your mutual aid comes from. Should be from the green grassroots areas where we've got lots of members. And I was talking to someone very high up in the party, right at the highest level a few years ago, about this problem. And he said, wow, don't worry, they've got nowhere else to go. And we now know that that is not true. So how are we as a party going to be able to increase our rural membership, not just our rural votes, we've talked about that, but actually our rural membership, because we desperately need to do that.
So how do we illustrate the custodianship of the countryside, and how does the Conservative Party increase membership as well as support? Greg, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think the custodianship of the countryside is actually the point I was making in my previous answer, that if it wasn't for farmers, it wouldn't look like it does, and nature wouldn't thrive, and all the other things that we see as a positive for the environment, for rural living, simply wouldn't exist. And I think it's reminding people of that symbiotic relationship between nature and farming that actually works in both's interests, and it is not one or the other. George, on your, we've talked about this lots over the years. We've got to have something positive to say that, yes, built on our successes and our achievements, but really sets out a positive vision for rural life, as well as agriculture, as well as rural pursuits going forward, that actually gets people excited about us again. Because there is a train of thought that you could say, well, look at what Labour are about to do. You know, they're naturally going to get grumpy with the government, and then we've just got to grab them. I don't think there is an automatic spring back to us unless we give that positive vision and engage properly with them, with farmers, with rural communities, with parishes, with sporting clubs, with everything else that goes on in the countryside. Yeah, I'm actually delighted. I know you've been part of it, George. Liz has just left, but that we've got the Conservative Rural Forum firing on all cylinders, cooking on gas, and the rest of it right now, because I think the CRF actually can play an enormously important role within the party of being that voice. You know, we've got lots of friends of groups, and they're all brilliant and they're all fantastic, and friends of different countries, and friends of the Environment Network, and all of those things. The CRF in its sort of rejuvenated form, I think, can play an enormously important role in ensuring the connection between membership and the shadow cabinet and the leadership and CCHQ can really make sure that we get this message right.
Eric, there's a bit that reminds me of the 97-2001 Parliament in that the small number of Conservative MPs at that time mainly represented Conservative rural constituencies, and frankly our job as Countryside Alliance and the Conservative Party was as easy as it could ever possibly be, because there was no one else left, frankly. It was rural MPs, and we are, let's be honest, largely in that situation again now. I think the question I tried to get to at the beginning, and probably and George might have got to it better, is how do we ensure that the next time that the Conservatives are in power when that base of MPs extends beyond the countryside into suburbia and urban constituencies, that we don't get that the rural vote doesn't get forgotten. It's that point that I made earlier about being taken for granted. And it may be a long time in the future, but I think we do need, as a party, my view is that you need to convince that rural electorate that not only are you there for them now, but you'll be there for them when you're in government next time. Sorry, just dump that on you.
No, that's fine, and I mean I don't disagree. I think any party of any colour who takes any part of the electorate for granted is onto a losing streak. And it's the rural community in particular, because yes, okay, traditionally we have relied on the rural vote, but it's transactional, same as any vote.
Yeah.
And if we're not offering leadership or opportunity to rural communities, why can we accept that vote? And it's certainly a two-way thing. But I think ways, I mean, you particularly said, how do we encourage younger generations, for example, to become members? I think what we can offer, or what membership can offer, is a sense of community. And we know in rural areas where there's isolation, or sort of just lack of opportunities to sort of link up with people elsewhere, the opportunity to actually discuss with like-minded people sort of similar concerns, issues, worries, and actually solutions to those. Because you all know that rural people are the most practical in the country, and they actually want to actually put their heads together and come up with actually this is how we need to do it. And that's the sort of thing that membership can offer. And that's how we need to sell it, sort of an opportunity to actually shape the future of countryside policy or rural policy, not just have it dictated to you. And on Shona's point, I completely understand what you're saying about sort of illustrating sort of the place of countryside within sort of the planet, like the holistic. And I think a really important way to do that is actually look what countryside and rural land offer us. So whether that's food security, energy security, flood defence, the front line of biosecurity, within that impacts everyone in the country, and it's vitally important. As important it is for someone who's opening the door of their farmhouses each day to the person opening the door of their flat in the middle of the city each day, but those things are preserved. And that's what rural land and rural people and rural countryside offer, and that's what we need to make clear, because it shows that it's important to everyone, it's important to the whole country.
Steve, would you like to?
To close, well, I think to some extent, how do we rebuild, including with the new generation, is the heart of what conference is about and what the leadership candidates are all discussing. But I'd probably try and summarise it with, I think the first question speaks in particular to language, communicating, and the second to values. Our values, my values as a Conservative, belief in freedom, in choice, in independence, reflects, I think, Harry's point to our place. And I think these are fundamentally Conservative values, and the ones that I see a Labour government as being out of touch with. They want to impose from top down. I mean, Starmer said very clearly on pilots, he wants to ignore the place. On solar farms, we're seeing decisions that ignore the place. They're not a party that believes in freedom. Just look at the debate, are they closing the hours of pubs down or are they not? It seemed one thing then another at their conference last week. There's a whole range of other things around food policy, drink policy, smoking policy, an outdoor garden. So they're not a party instinctively that believes in freedom, as I do as a Conservative. And I think those are things that matter not just to the next generation, but look at Canada, where the Conservatives in Canada are appealing to the generation beyond that. So they're the 18-25 age group, not just the 40-something. So I think that, and the thing that links into that as well is, as part of this rebuild, we need to think about also how we're communicating. So, for example, digitally, it might be around specific campaigns. So if I take one that's very live at the moment, and perhaps one for people as we close to reflect on, which is that when I was Secretary of State, there had been underspending in the NEPA budget, but we agreed with the Treasury they would stay within the department, which is how we announced at the NFU conference the biggest ever grants programme. What we're seeing now is a DEFRA team who seem to be engineering underspends by not spending money on established schemes. So I announced in May 50 million of additional flood support Now, no one can't say that there hasn't been a need with the wet weather for that money. We announced it in May, but it's not gone out the door. We announced 75 million for drainage boards. Anyone who understands the rural areas with drainage boards knows how central they are. They're absolutely crucial in areas like mine. In effect, that money hasn't gone out to the door. And the big worry is an urban government, unsympathetic to rural communities, will not get that money out of the door, and then will return it at the budget to the Treasury. And if you're then a farmer who loses out on that money, or you're a farmer that floods, that is the sort of thing that will certainly grab their attention. And so I think we've got to communicate around specific issues. We've got to think about how we communicate digitally and in other channels. But fundamentally, I think it's about our values and making sure that those values come clearly through to the electorate. And I would say it's not just the over 40s. We've got to think about all age groups. And I genuinely believe with the Spotify generation, you know, all age groups care about housing, about skills, about aspiration. Look at what we have done on apprenticeships. That's a great message for young people. And I think there's a lot more we can do in terms of how we communicate that.
Thank you, Steve. That's been a brilliant session. We're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you all for engaging. Only two more things to say. One is that I shouldn't miss this opportunity to promote the Countryside Alliance's motion. If you are a councillor, we've got a couple of dozen councils now who've passed a motion committing to local food procurement. If you'd like to take that on, do talk to us. That was in response to Labour, Lib Dem and Green councillors moving motions to ban the serving of meat, red meat on council property through councils. And it's a really positive. You know, it's about about local sourcing, whether we're talking about vegetarian or meat products. So that's something that some of you might consider worth doing. But secondly, most importantly, is to thank our panellists. That was a really interesting look around our issues. We know that the rural issues go on forever, so we'll never catch up with everything. But thank you so much, and I'm quite sure that with people like the people in front of you, that the Conservative Party will find its way to reconnecting where it has to with the countryside, and I'm sure that in a few years' time we will hopefully see more than 120 of us here at conference. So thank you all. Thank you for coming.